It's easy to imagine the Oregon Trail as a straight line on a map, a clear road leading inexorably forward. For anyone traveling it, though, the reality was more like a river delta. Many trails led into the west, and none of them were straight. There were shortcuts that ended in disaster, detours around Native American territories, and hazards like rivers, mountains, and disease. Some people even turned back before they started. But for those that continued, there was no turning back. Not only because the journey took months and all their provisions would be used up along the way, but because the very notion of returning was unthinkable. To turn back would be to admit defeat against an adventure that had captured the imaginations of so many Easterners. A trip out west on the Oregon Trail was more than a journey. It was an existential test. How could anyone who valued freedom and prosperity not want to claim land in the fertile Willamette Valley? Returning east would mean admitting the dream was just that, a dream. So travelers pressed forward, and when they died, they kept going. Sometimes the dead stayed in the wagon. They were buried under the floorboards, and the team continued to haul them forward until they reached a place to stop. Other times, the body was laid out on the ground, usually wrapped in a blanket, and the entire company prayed before they covered the corpse in the dirt. It was common practice to bring a small shovel on the journey, as well as rope to bury the body securely. Often family members would bring a coffin, but those weren't always sturdy enough to survive the journey. If no coffin or blankets were available, then rocks were brought in to weigh down the body. In at least one case, a body was suspended in the air by a crane, keeping it above the ground, which disgusted those who saw it and inspired a poem. The most important thing about burying the dead was that it happened quickly. No one wanted to spend any more time around a body than necessary, both for practical reasons and because the person was seen as contaminated by death. In fact, bodies were often buried on the right side of the trail, while the living preferred to camp on the left. That was the case for the Mills family in 1849. As the group moved through Kansas, they came upon an abandoned wagon train, binding to graves along the route. Then tragedy struck. Their 3-year-old son drowned in the nearby creek. When the funeral was done, the family resumed their journey toward Oregon Territory, eventually reaching California, where they lived for a time before moving north. Years later, Mary Mills wrote down the details of their travels, including this heartbreaking description of her brother's funeral. His little body was washed, his hair combed, and put on a little suit of linen. We sang and prayed, and then he was taken to his long home. After we had gone on for a few days, my father went back to see his resting place, but could not find it. The banks of the stream had caved in, and all trace of our little brother was soon lost to view. Not all grave sites were lost to time. Some people erected monuments, each one a testament to the ingenuity and desperation of the pioneers. When Sarah Roysnap's daughter died on the trail in 1863, her father, Alpheus, carved a headstone from a tree. He buried his daughter Eliza with her favorite doll and covered them both with a cedar panel. He then used a parking chisel to carve an epitaph, reading, "Under this stone lies the body of Miss Eliza A. Royce, daughter of Alfonso and Sarah Knapp, aged 1 year and 7 months. She died August 18, 1863. Unlike the Royce family, some families traveling west were broken apart by death. William T. Slocum kept a diary of his experiences on the trail, and his descriptions give a sense of the difficulties the travelers faced. After leaving Wisconsin in March 1847, Slocum and his party moved steadily westward. They followed the Missouri River until April, when they left the safety of the river and headed into the wilderness. Then misfortune struck. One day, the 23-year-old Sally Clark, who was traveling with her husband and child, died. Her body was placed in a coffin and lowered into a grave near the bank of a creek. The next day, the rest of the party continued their journey, unable to say goodbye to the one they'd left behind. Traveling in the wilderness did not come without its perils, and throughout the 1800s, much of the United States was patrolled by by bands of warriors who considered the land theirs long before European Americans showed up. While many tribes did fight back against those trying to take their land, others did their best to avoid conflict. As European Americans grew in number, violence often seemed unavoidable. Attacks by natives on travelers were commonly reported after the events of 1864, when Colonel J.J. Reynolds and his men fought a battle with the Cheyenne and Arapaho near Fort Morgan, Colorado. At least 150 native warriors are believed to have attacked the train. Of the nearly 400 people present, 136 survived. This event became known as the Sand Creek Massacre, despite the peace treaty between the tribes and the U.S. government. Following this incident, the U.S. military attempted to relocate Cheyenne and Arapaho to a reservation in Oklahoma. During this relocation, 380 people died from starvation and exposure. Their remains were buried at the site now known as the Chivington Cemetery, where a monument marks the massacre. As the years passed, attacks like these increased in frequency, making the journey west more dangerous than ever before. Travelers were advised to carry firearms, hire a guide, or join a larger group to protect themselves. These incidents also influenced how people thought about the tribes they encountered. Historian Robert M. Utley writes in his book, The Indian in America, that in the minds of many whites, Indians were no longer seen as noble savages worthy of respect. Instead, they were viewed as an inferior race that needed to be removed from their ancestral lands. All these threats to life, whether human or animal, were overcome by a much more mundane force, one that caused more deaths than any other, disease. And this wasn't limited to travelers on the Oregon Trail. Entire settlements fell victim to deadly outbreaks of cholera, smallpox, and typhoid fever. In June 1849, 19-year-old Eliza Bryant recorded the death of one of her companions from what was likely cholera. The symptoms came on suddenly, and by morning he was dead. He has been dead several days, yet no post-mortem has taken place. We are all more or less afraid to examine the body for fear of infection. She described the burial ceremony, writing, "The body was then placed in a coffin and committed to the silent tomb." The melancholy procession consisted of 4 persons, the only companions of the departed. Brian's fears of infection were well-founded. Typhoid, fever, and cholera killed hundreds of pioneers traveling to Oregon and California. Conditions were ripe for an outbreak since travelers were in close contact with one another and sanitation was poor. Also, most people had no immunity to the diseases. When an outbreak hit, the mortality rate was high. Though the Oregon Trail was only used for about 75 years, the impact it had on history was huge. Tens of thousands of people died during the Great Migration of the 1840s and 50s, many of them from disease. But the pioneers' dreams of building new lives in the fertile valleys of the Willamette persisted, driving them to push on toward the west. Now, if you want to learn more about the fascinating history of the Oregon Trail, click here to watch this video or click here to watch this video. In the 1800s, thousands of pioneers braved the Oregon Trail. These days, we tend to think of those journeys as filled with covered wagons rolling along serenely through stunning landscapes. But that image couldn't be further from the truth. The trip west was terrifying. You could be fine at breakfast and dead by dinner. The symptoms were brutal: vomiting, diarrhea, rapid dehydration, muscle cramps. There was no cure, no antibiotics, no hospitals. And so, people died fast. Other dangers lurked quietly. If cholera didn't claim you, something else might. Accidental shootings were surprisingly common. A jostled rifle in a wagon, misfire while hunting, children playing with pistols their fathers forgot to secure. Wagon accidents also took lives. A child falling under a wheel, an adult crushed while repairing a broken axle, a woman tossed from the seat during a rough descent. Then there were the river drownings, snake bites, exposure, and starvation, each one an ever-present threat, and sometimes people just disappeared. They wandered off to gather firewood and never came back, or they collapsed behind the wagons from exhaustion, never noticed until campfires were lit, and it was too late when death came. It didn't wait. There was no time for long funerals, no time to mourn properly. The trail demanded movement. The wagons had to roll. So when someone died, they were buried, often within hours. Sometimes there was a simple prayer. Sometimes just a few tears and a shared moment of silence. A mound of earth, a stone marker, if there was time. In many cases, the graves were disguised, trampled with oxen hooves to make it seem like no one had died there. This was done to protect the resting place from animals and, tragically, grave robbers. Sometimes a crude marker was erected, a stick with initials carved in, a Bible page folded under a stone, a scrap of cloth tied to a wagon wheel. But mostly the trail buried the dead and moved on. Children were not spared. The Oregon Trail claimed many young lives, but this wasn't their fault. One pioneer boy, Thomas Lauderdale, was only 4 years old when he began his journey west. He lived through much of the trek with his sister Mary and parents, John and Priscilla. Together, they traveled in a group led by the earnest and devout Lorenzo and Eliza Snow, who dreamed of building Zion in the Willamette Valley. Thomas remembered the trip vividly. He recalled the fear inspired by the wild terrain and the loss of loved ones to illness and accidents. Years later, he wrote, "The hardships endured by us as a family and others was such that had we been left alone to our own devices, we should all have perished. Our father was killed by an accidental discharge of his gun. Our mother sickened and died from eating unripe cherries. Our brother Charles died from exposure and our sister Mary from acute indigestion. Only Thomas and his infant sister Eliza survived." His story is tragic, but far from unique. As the pioneers pushed further west, they followed the winding path blazed by earlier explorers and trappers. This route would become known as the Oregon Trail, stretching over 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon. For the first leg of their journey, travelers headed south along the Missouri River to the Kansas-Nebraska border. Then they turned north, crossing the prairie to the Platte River in Nebraska. Here, travelers left the relative safety of the river and headed into the rugged Rocky Mountains. The goal was to reach the Columbia River in Oregon, where supply ships awaited to take the weary pioneers the rest of the way to the Pacific Northwest. Along the way, they faced obstacles both natural and man-made. Travelers had to contend with river crossings, broken axles, animal attacks, disease, and one particularly terrifying event, Native American tribes who were protective of their land. Some tribes welcomed the travelers, trading with them and providing necessary supplies. Others were less friendly. Conflict between settlers and Native Americans was inevitable, resulting in bloody battles and massacres. And then there was the landscape itself. The open plains gave way to treacherous mountain passes, swollen rivers, deep ravines, and steep hills. Most of the year, the terrain was a muddy morass that stuck to travelers like a second skin. During the winter months, it transformed into a frozen wasteland. But the harshest reality of trail life was time. Each day on the trail was a victory. Every hour that passed brought the travelers closer to their destination, but that hard-won progress came at a cost. As weeks turned into months, the toll on the human body became immeasurable. Those traveling on the Oregon Trail were exposed to the elements day and night. Shelter was scarce, as was food and clean water. Pioneers slept in the open air, huddled together for warmth against the bitter cold. Sleep was fitful and often abandoned altogether as travelers were forced to watch over their meager belongings. Life on the trail was physically exhausting. Men, women, and children worked tirelessly to keep the wagon train moving forward. Their days were filled with tedious tasks like cooking, cleaning, mending, driving oxen, and searching for firewood. Men typically did most of the heavy lifting, but everyone pitched in to keep the wagons rolling. Women managed the household, cared for children, and prepared meals while also driving oxen and caring for other animals. Even small children were given tasks appropriate for their age. Boys looked after younger siblings, while girls helped with cooking and cleaning. And when the time came for a wagon train to cross a river, every able-bodied person pitched in to get the wagons from point A to point B. Everyone helped because everyone's survival depended on the collective effort. Pioneers walked behind their wagons carrying essential items like food and clothing. They didn't carry tents or other portable shelters since they relied on the wagons to keep them safe from the elements. Inside each wagon, there were basic supplies, including beds, chests for clothes, and kitchen boxes. Some wagons were more spacious than others, but generally space was limited, forcing families to live out of their chests and pack carefully. They also brought domesticated animals with them, including cows, horses, sheep, goats, and pigs. These animals provided food, milk, and leather, and they were herded alongside the wagons, eating grass as they went. Each day, pioneers woke before sunrise and started a fire to cook breakfast. Their meals were simple and repetitive, consisting of flour, cornmeal, bacon, and dried meat. As the day progressed, the men would mend the equipment, the women would wash clothes, and the children would help out where needed. They stopped around noon for lunch, then resumed their trek in the afternoon. The daily routine continued until sunset, when the family would stop for the night, build a campfire, and tuck in for dinner. After dark, everyone would huddle around the fire for warmth and companionship. Sometimes they told stories or sang songs. Other times they sat in silence, watching the flames dance before them. It might seem idyllic, but trail life was anything but. Accidents were common, as were fights with animals, each wagon train's most dangerous enemy. Disease was always present. Cholera was the most common, killing hundreds, sometimes thousands in a single season. Ordinary cuts or scratches could turn deadly due to a lack of proper medical care. And there were other maladies: smallpox, measles, malaria, typhoid fever, dysentery, and even the common cold. While few treatments were available, some pioneers brought home remedies with them, including herbs and other natural substances. Medical professionals did accompany some wagon trains, but their skills were limited and they lacked sufficient supplies. Injuries, illnesses, and diseases ran rampant. Death, too, was a constant companion. It seemed that every mile along the Oregon Trail was marked by a graveyard, and the youngest were the most vulnerable. Few things were more heartbreaking than the loss of a child. When death struck, it struck quickly and brutally. Smallpox was especially deadly to children, killing hundreds, perhaps thousands of them along the Oregon Trail. When a child died, the family would lay them out on a blanket, wrap them in a coffin, and lower them into the ground. A wooden cross was usually placed at the head of the grave, bearing the deceased's name and age. Children weren't the only victims. In total, it's estimated that between 1841 and 1869, more than 20,000 people died on the Oregon Trail. That staggering number represents the countless individuals who embarked on the journey west in search of new opportunities and a better life. It includes men, women, and children who dreamt of building homes in the fertile valleys of the Willamette and Columbia rivers. But it also encompasses those who sought to escape the hardships of their current lives, those looking for adventure, and those simply curious about what lay beyond the horizon. Among them were the ambitious, the hopeful, the curious, the adventurous, and the desperate. Together, they formed a diverse community bound by a common purpose, driven by dreams of a brighter future on the other side of the continent. Their stories are a testament to the enduring spirit of exploration, the relentless pursuit of opportunity, and the unyielding determination of those who dared to venture into the unknown. As we reflect on their legacy, let us remember not only the challenges they faced, but also the hopes and aspirations that led them to brave the perils of the Oregon Trail and ultimately shape the course of American history. That concludes part 3 of our series. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more historical tales. Until next time, farewell. Good morning, friends. I'm here. Welcome to the house. Today, we are looking at a photograph from the Oregon Trail. This is one of my favorite topics because I have such an interest in this subject. So today, we're going to talk about the impact of the Oregon Trail on children and how children did not fare well on the Oregon Trail. The first thing we have to realize is that children were incredibly vulnerable. They were vulnerable to the diseases that came along the trail, just like adults, but they were also vulnerable to starvation. They were also vulnerable to the general hardships that come with living out on the trail. And they were vulnerable to the emotional impact of the trail. So let's talk a little bit more about that before we look at this picture. So there are lots of things that children did to help out on the trail. In fact, they started helping out at a very young age. Little boys would be given, the small jobs, fetching and carrying things, helping out with the oxen. And then, as they got older, they could help drive the oxen or the cows, do chores, take care of the younger siblings, things like that. But that is not what we're talking about when we say that they were emotionally impacted by this experience. What we're saying is that their mental health suffered on the Oregon Trail. It was difficult to be a child on the Oregon Trail. One of the main reasons is that there wasn't a lot of joy. When you're traveling on the Oregon Trail, you are moving day after day after day. You don't have time to play, and if you were an adult, you wouldn't have time to play either. There wasn't a lot of laughter on the Oregon Trail. It was a serious business to get your family from point A to point B, so even the parents weren't in a jovial mood a lot of times. So children who were used to having fun with mom and dad, or being able to run and play or do things, were sort of missing out on that childhood. And it's no wonder that many of them suffered emotionally from that. Another thing is that the dangers of the trail. Children, even if they were old enough to understand what was happening, they knew when something dangerous was happening, whether it was getting attacked by Native Americans, or having a wagon accident, or crossing a river that might take their lives. So they lived in constant fear of losing their life on the trail and losing their parents. And that's an incredible burden to put on a child. And then, of course, the other danger is that the children themselves might die. And that was something that happened every single day on the Oregon Trail. A mother would wake up in the morning and find that her child had died during the night. And then she would have to take the body, wrap them up, bury them next to the trail, and then get back on the wagon within the hour, if not sooner, and move on down the trail. Can you imagine how hard that is on a mother or on a father? And then also the children who witnessed that and saw that happen every single day, knowing that it could be them tonight. That their parents would have to wrap them up and bury them by the side of the trail and then move on down the path. That's a heavy burden for a child to bear. And it's no wonder that so many of them suffered emotionally from that. And then the last reason that children did not fare well on the Oregon Trail is because there was no time to grieve. If a child died, the family could not stay and grieve that loss. They couldn't sit and have a funeral. They couldn't even stay for one night to mourn that loss. They had to pick up and leave and move on down the trail, and so grief became a very quiet thing. It was something that you kept inside and carried, but you didn't have time to speak about it. You didn't have time to cry. And that's why a lot of the diaries and journals talk about people feeling guilty that they didn't cry enough, that they moved on too soon, that they ate a meal after burying their child. And that's something that people did not do on the Oregon Trail. They had to keep moving. And so they felt guilty about that. They felt guilty for not being able to grieve properly. And that's something that really affected the mental health of the travelers, especially the children. Now, this is a very serious topic, and I want to make sure that we don't minimize any of those feelings. I don't want to make light of this situation at all. However, I will say that some of these people, even as they talked about their grief, they found comfort in talking about it. They found comfort in writing about it. And that's the same for us. If you need to talk about someone you've lost, it can be helpful to find somebody to talk to about that. It doesn't lessen your grief. Sometimes it makes you feel like you can carry that burden a little bit easier. All right, friends, now let's look at this photograph. This is a photograph of a pioneer child who died on the Oregon Trail. We don't have a name for this child, unfortunately, but I think he is absolutely adorable and precious, and I hope we can learn a little bit about pioneer children through this photograph. First of all, he is not dressed in pioneer garb. Pioneer children did not wear store-bought clothing like this. These are probably hand-me-downs. Maybe his sister or brother wore this before him, and it's a common clothing style of the time period, but it's not something that would have been made specifically. Pioneer children did not have a lot of clothing, and they certainly didn't have a lot of fancy clothing. They needed simple clothing to help them survive on the trail, and that's what they wore. So that's one of the things that stands out to me about this picture. The other thing is his shoes. He does not have any shoes on. It's likely that this was just a hot summer's day, and it was too hot for him to wear shoes. But typically, pioneer children would not have worn shoes. They would have gone barefoot. And that's another clue that tells us that this was a very casual photograph. A formal photograph would have had him wearing a shirt and maybe even shoes. But this is just a picture that was taken because people wanted to remember their children. They didn't want to forget what they looked like, especially when they were traveling under such difficult conditions. It's important for us to remember that the Oregon Trail was a dangerous journey for everyone, and especially for children. Nearly 10,000 people died on the Oregon Trail, and many of them were children. Why you wouldn't last a day on the Oregon Trail? The Oregon Trail was a 2,000-mile journey across the United States that pioneers traveled during the 1840s and 1850s. It is one of the most well-known trails in American history. People traveled this trail for many reasons, but mainly to seek new land for farming or gold. What they encountered along the way tested the strength and endurance of both their bodies and minds. Today, we will talk about how traveling on the Oregon Trail would affect people mentally. So, buckle up, partner, because it's gonna be a bumpy ride. Let's get into it. Death, heartache, and grief, but the trail demanded practicality. Even in death, when heading out west, it was best to leave the weak behind. Yes, that includes you if you become weak. The trail claimed many lives. Disease, exhaustion, and hunger ran rampant among the travelers, especially towards the end when supplies were low. And what wasn't easily remedied? There was no room for sentimentality here. If you couldn't make the journey, then someone else had to take care of you. And by someone else, we mean someone else. Imagine it. One moment, you are sleeping next to your spouse, laughing with them as the fire crackles nearby, the darkness outside broken only by the light of the flames. Then suddenly, before the sun rises, they're gone. They didn't wake up. In the morning, after a fitful sleep, you try to rouse them, but their breathing is shallow and they don't respond to your touch. Perhaps a fever took them or cholera. Maybe they didn't eat enough or drink enough water. You don't know, there isn't time to know. The rest of your party, your wagon train, is preparing for an early start. You need to get moving. There is no time to grieve. No time to bury your spouse properly. Just time to move on. If there were children, then someone would have to tell them that their parent isn't waking up, that they've died. But what could you possibly say? How do you explain death to a child? Do you even have the heart to try? Do you explain that their parent has gone away and won't be back, hoping that's all they remember? or do you tell them the truth? Because either way, you are breaking your child's heart. And you must be strong for them now, because you are all they have left. This happens on the trail. A person dies, usually of disease, and there isn't time to mourn. You must keep moving. Some families turn inward, becoming stoic, silent, emotionless. It was easier that way. They just kept going, hoping that someday things would get better. But the trail was cruel. Sometimes it was hard to keep going, harder still to keep going and stay hopeful. For other families, faith was their solace. Reading scripture aloud each evening helped them cope. They believed their loved ones had gone ahead to a better place, at least for a while, until they too would join them. And then there were those who simply didn't speak of it again. Which type of person do you think you'd be on the Oregon Trail? Would you be able to handle the loss of a loved one without breaking down? We want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let's discuss. Wilderness survival aside from the emotional toll the trail took on travelers, it also forced them to adapt to the wilderness around them. They needed to understand the plants and animals they encountered and learn to survive off the land. Pioneers used every part of the animals they hunted, eating their meat and using their hides for clothing and shelter. They also learned to identify edible plants and berries and use natural materials for tools and weapons. At times, hunting was more challenging than others. Many hunters recounted stories of missing their marks, sometimes because of wild animals that seemed determined to distract them. Imagine being so focused on taking down your prey that you do and see a bear charging at you until it escalates. Talk about a nightmare scenario. Do you think you could handle the pressure of hunting for your survival? Would you be able to stay calm and focused even when things go wrong? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying it so far. The loneliness, one of the most difficult aspects of traveling on the Oregon Trail, was the loneliness. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to spend weeks or even months without seeing another human being. The vastness of the landscape and the isolation it brought could be overwhelming at times. In fact, some people chose to turn back rather than continue on such a lonely journey. But for those who pressed on, the solitude became a part of their daily lives. Travelers often described the loneliness as a heavy weight that settled on their shoulders, making each day feel heavier than the last. It's important to remember that these pioneers weren't just traveling for adventure or excitement. Most of them were leaving everything familiar behind in search of a better life. They were driven by a desire for more land, for a fresh start. However, as they ventured further and further into unknown territory, the reality of their situation began to set in. They realized that they were truly alone, cut off from everything they had ever known. As the miles stretched on endlessly before them, many started to question whether it was worth the sacrifice. After all, what was waiting for them at the end of this long, lonely trail? Can you imagine how these pioneers felt as they made their way through unfamiliar landscapes, unsure of what lay ahead? Did their dreams of a better life keep them going, or did the loneliness eventually catch up with them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The dangers of the trail. For pioneers traveling on the Oregon Trail, danger lurked around every bend. From dangerous animals to harsh weather conditions, there was always the possibility that things could go wrong and turn deadly. Let's start with the wildlife. As you trek through the wilderness, you're bound to encounter some pretty dangerous animals, including bears, mountain lions, and wolves. These predators were not only looking for food, but also seeking to defend their territory. So if you wandered too close or made a wrong move, you could easily find yourself in a fight for your life. And that's not even mentioning the smaller, more elusive dangers like snakes and poisonous plants. Just one wrong step could lead to a venomous bite or a bad case of poison ivy. To make matters worse, getting injured out on the trail was no small matter. Medical supplies were limited and the nearest doctor might be days away, so a simple cut or bruise could quickly turn into a life-threatening infection if not treated properly. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of surviving on the Oregon Trail was dealing with the constant threat of starvation and dehydration. Unlike today, where grocery stores are just a quick drive away, pioneers had to carefully ration their food and water supplies. Rations consisted of dried meat, flour, and coffee, which were carefully measured out each day to ensure everyone got an equal share. Water, too, was precious and had to be boiled before drinking to kill any harmful bacteria. Not only did this make it safe to consume, but it also meant that there was less water available for other uses like cleaning or watering crops. The Oregon Trail was a perilous journey for those who traveled it. Pioneers faced many dangers, including wild animals, harsh weather, and the risk of starvation or dehydration. It's hard to believe that anyone could survive such conditions, yet many did. Their resilience and determination in the face of adversity serve as an inspiration for us all. How do you think you'd fare on the Oregon Trail? Would you be able to handle the loneliness, the danger, and the heartache that came with this journey? Let us know in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical tales. Thanks for watching. You wouldn't last a day, not if the person beside you died and you had to dig their grave with your hands. Not if you had to tuck your child's quilt over their lifeless body and walk away forever. That kind of sorrow, it changes you. It chews you up inside and spits you out, hardened and hollow. I know this because I used to think that I was stronger than that. I used to think I could handle anything life threw at me. Then my wife died on the Oregon Trail. I should tell you right up front, I didn't kill her. She died from exposure, the same way our baby died. It wasn't like I was running some fever dream where you cut off the heads of all the settlers with an axe. I lost them both. I buried them beneath an old oak tree next to a dried up creek bed, just past the ridge where we stopped for the night. It was 1847. We were 2 months into our journey west, and by God, it felt like a lifetime ago. I don't remember much about that first year after they buried my wife and child. All I know is that I kept walking. There was nothing left for me back there. So I walked. I didn't talk much. I didn't need to. My feet knew the trail and my body knew how to keep moving forward. It was different for the other folks, though. They had families waiting for them at the end of this journey. They had houses and fields and businesses. There was something worth living for. I don't mean to judge them, but some of them had tears in their eyes every time they looked at the ground. You'd see these big, burly men, faces covered in beard, hands like iron hooks, and they'd be wiping the sweat off their brows with one hand while they clutched a handkerchief in the other. And then they'd stop and they'd stare off at nothing in particular, and you could see the tears glistening in their eyes. There was one guy, Reed, who couldn't take it anymore. He broke down in the middle of the day and started screaming. He wanted to go back. He wanted to find his wife and kids and bring them out west with him, but you can't do that. Once you get to that point, you can't turn back. There ain't no other direction to go but forward. This thing called the Oregon Trail, it lines get inside you and twist itself around your insides until you read just a shell of a man. Let the trail rest, but now as the night deepens, let the trail fall silent again. Imagine the moon rising over a grassy hill, a breeze brushing over a mound of freshly turned earth. Somewhere an old wooden cross leans in the line, carved with initials long forgotten. The wagons have moved on, but the memory lingers. Sleep gently, dear listener. You've made it through another day on the trail. It's strange what you think about when you're walking along a river for weeks on end. It's hard to say what passes through your mind when you got nothing else to do. Some days I think about the food I'm gonna eat when I reach Oregon. I heard tell there's salmon so thick on the rivers you could walk across on their backs. And I hear tell the berries are ripe and juicy and the wheat grows taller than a man. There's all kinds of critters out there, too. bear, deer, elk, maybe I'll even hunt some buffalo. Then I think about the house I'll build. How it'll be different from the shack I grew up in. Different from the hovel I lived in with Martha and the kids. Out west, Highlines build a real house with solid walls and a porch swing, and maybe a well to pull water up from the ground. It'll be nice to finally have roots, to put down stakes in one place for once. The truth is, I've been running my whole life. When I was a boy, I ran away from home to join the circus. I joined up as an archer and spent years traveling the country, learning to shoot. I was good, too. I could hit the broadside of a barn with 6 out of 10 arrows. But you don't make much money being a one-trick pony. And eventually the carnival moved on and I stayed behind. I got myself a job working for the railroad. Then I saved up enough money to buy myself a farm, and that's where I met Martha. She was a strong-willed woman, stubborn as a mule. But she could also cook a chicken dinner better than anybody I ever tasted. We bought a small place outside of Independence, Missouri. It was a good life. It was simple, and after a few years, it was a little crowded. So we sold the farm and we packed up everything we owned and we headed west. And now here I am, walking behind a wagon train full of strangers, eating the same beans every day, sleeping under the stars. Eventually, I'll reach Oregon, or so I keep telling myself. Some days I wonder if that's true. Some days I feel like I'm walking through mud, knee-deep, trying to get somewhere, but I never get any closer. I remember one night sitting around the campfire and I heard somebody play a tune on the fiddle. At first, it was just a single note. It was mournful, sad, real sad. Then the fiddler started picking up the pace. The bow danced across the strings and the music rose up, swelling and soaring until it seemed like it would burst out of my ears. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The fiddler lowered his bow and the silence pressed in on us, heavier than a shroud. Somebody started coughing, then somebody else began to speak. The fire crackled. The horses stamped their hooves on the hard-packed ground. And that song, it just hung in the air between us. I don't know why it affected me so much. Maybe it reminded me of home. Maybe it was just the sound of somebody playing an instrument for a change. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first honest-to-God piece of music I'd heard since my wife played a waltz for me on the parlor organ before we left Independence. Let the trail rest, but now as the night deepens, let the trail fall silent again. Imagine the moon rising over a grassy hill, a breeze brushing over a mound of freshly turned earth. Somewhere an old wooden cross leans in the light, carved with initials long forgotten. The wagons have moved on, but the memory lingers. Sleep gently, dear listener. You've made it through another day on the trail. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I think about the things people do to survive. I think about how far a man will go to protect his family. I think about how far a man will go to avenge his family. Sometimes I think about killing men. Not just killing them, but what I would do to their bodies afterwards. I think about making examples out of people. I think about the things I've seen and the things I've done. I was always willing to lay down my life for Martha and the kids. Hell, I'd do the same for my pa and ma, even though they never did much to earn it. But some folks don't understand the difference between protecting your family and avenging them. Take that guy, Reed, the one who wanted to head back. After he freaked out, he started shooting at random things. First it was a snake, then a jackrabbit, then one of the oxen. Before long, he was shooting at the other settlers. They beat him up pretty good, but when they weren't looking, he took his rifle and he shot the cook. Now they're calling him a murderer, but I don't think he's a murderer. I think he's sick. When I was a young lad, my ma would rock me and hum a song while she rocked. It was the only time she was ever soft with me. I don't remember much of the words, but sometimes when I lie awake at night thinking about killing men, I start to hum that tune, and suddenly I am a little boy lying in the dirt with a runny nose and a skinned knee. I close my eyes and I imagine my mother kneeling beside me, dabbing the blood and dirt off my face with a handkerchief. I can feel her calloused thumb stroking my hair, and I can hear her voice saying, there, it's all right, you're safe now. It's all right, it's all right, it's all right. And for just a moment, I believe her. For just a moment, I am safe. Let the trail rest, but now as the night deepens, let the trail fall silent again. Imagine the moon rising over a grassy hill, a breeze brushing over a mound of freshly turned earth. Somewhere an old wooden cross leans in the wind, carved with initials long forgotten. The wagons have moved on, but the memory lingers. Sleep gently, dear listener. You've made it through another day on the trail. They came from the south, hot and fast, then ripped across the Great Plains like a living thing, these prairie fires. And once they started, nothing could stop them. Not rivers, not ravines, not even the hard-panned ground itself could hold back their hungry march. For days, maybe weeks, they roared over the horizon, licking up everything before them, turning lush grasslands into smoldering wastelands. Those who stayed behind to watch the trail turn to ash knew they were watching the end of something big, something wild, something free. They were watching America burn. This is the story of the prairie and the people who tamed it, a story of struggle and survival, of hope and heartache. And now you can own it on Blu-ray. That's right, the complete series is now available on this amazing collector's edition box set. 36 all-new bonus features, including an original score by Academy Award winner James Horner and exclusive behind-the-scenes footage. Plus, the mini-series stars Sam Elliott and Kevin Costner reunite to take you even deeper into the making of the epic saga. Don't wait, order now. And I'll include a free autograph letter from Sam Elliott when supplies last. Call today. That's 1886, 247. And remember, no trees were harmed in the making of this book. When the sun beat down on the plains, it beat down hard. On the Oregon Trail, folks suffered sunstroke and heat stroke. They blistered and they burned. Every day was a gamble. Would it be clear skies and fair winds, or scorching sun and suffocating heat? By midday, the thermometer climbed to dangerous heights. The shade offered little relief. Hats and handkerchiefs did, too. Soon the only thoughts in your head were drink, shave, water. One misstep and you could collapse, delirious and helpless, another victim of the unforgiving prairie. The sun didn't care if you made it another day, neither did the mosquitoes. When the temperatures rose, so did the insects. From early spring to late fall, the plains swarmed with mosquitoes. Day or night, they feasted on travelers, biting through clothing, through flesh, through even the thickest wagon canvas. Their bites itched, burned, swelled. Worse, they carried diseases that ran like wildfire through pioneer camps. Malaria and yellow fever, spotted fevers and encephalitis, all reminders that the prairie wasn't just unforgiving, it was downright hostile. But perhaps the worst trial of all was the isolation. The feeling that the vastness of the prairie was closing in, that the horizon was reaching out to swallow you whole. With no roads, no towns, no familiar faces for hundreds of miles around, it was easy to lose yourself on the prairie. All around you stretched the endless sea of grasses, waving in the wind, hiding what lay beyond in the shimmering heat haze. East, west, north, and south, the prairie stretched on forever. The nearest neighbor could be days away, a day's walk, a week's journey. The prairie was a place where people came to disappear, where secrets went to hide, and dreams came to die. The Oregon Trail beckoned with the promise of a new life, an escape from the crowds and clamor of civilization. But the journey to get there was a different matter. It was a test of endurance, a battle against nature, and one you might not survive. So as you set out across the plains, make sure you brought more than just provisions and tools. Bring along plenty of courage, a whole wagon load of patience, and enough hope to last the rest of your life. because out here, the only law was survival. When the snow fell on the prairie, it blanketed the world in white and shut down the trail. For some, winter on the plains meant cozy evenings by the fire, reading books by lamplight, listening to crickets chirp outside the warm wagon. But for most, winter was a fight for survival. Blizzards struck without warning, swirling across the prairie, whipping the temperature down below zero in minutes. The wind cut like a knife through canvas and flesh, clawed at blankets, froze fingers and toes in its icy grip, and sent whole herds of cattle crashing to the frozen ground. Days blurred together in a whiteout. North and south, east and west all meant the same thing: bitter cold and deep snow. The only way to keep going was to keep moving. Each traveler had to trudge through drifts knee-deep, whip the oxen forward, drive the cows, keep everyone moving. Even if it seemed pointless, even if it felt like Sisyphus' rock rolling endlessly down the hill, each step was a victory over the cold. Each mile brought you closer to safety. In the end, the journey wasn't just about reaching the end of the trail. It was about making it through the winter alive. Floods came suddenly in the spring when the snows melted fast. Rushing water carved gullies in the ground, undermining hillsides and swallowing wagon tracks. People fell victim to drowning, swept away in the rising waters. Fording streams became raging rivers. Bridges gave way to rushing torrents. And when the waters receded, they left behind a landscape of mud, mire, and muck. The land that moments before had been solid ground turned to thick, sucking mud. The slightest misstep could mean sinking in up to your knees, up to your waist, up to your neck. Traction was impossible. Progress hopeless. The trail turned to a quagmire, a treacherous mess of sucking mud and hidden holes. Every step was a gamble. Every inch of progress came at a terrible cost. There was no byway around a flood, no bridge over rushing waters. There was only forward, and if the water wasn't deep enough to drown you, it could still pull you under. In the end, pioneers had to face the terrifying truth. No matter how tough they were, no matter how many hardships they endured, the prairie was a force they couldn't control. Tested everything they had, took everything they loved, and sometimes it broke them anyway. Whether it was a raging blizzard or a flash flood, a prairie fire or a dust storm, the elements had the final say. This land was wild, untamed, and it would keep testing them again and again, pushing them to their limits, reminding them who was really in charge out here. It was the land or the sky. The people on the Oregon Trail soon learned that there was no winning either way. You don't move west unless you're ready for everything the land can throw at you. That's a lesson our pioneers learned the hard way. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this house. Today, we are exploring the Oregon Trail and other trails west. And it's time to face one of Mother Nature's most powerful forces, the weather. If you've been with us for any amount of time, you probably know how much we love a good supercell thunderstorm. But our pioneers did not have the luxury of loving thunderstorms. They were dangerous, deadly, terrifying things that could turn a pleasant summer day into a nightmare pretty fast. And if you think a little rain is no big deal, think again. Our first obstacle is a little rain on the trail. At first, it might seem like a blessing. It's hot, dusty, and dry on the prairie, and a little rain would be a nice change of pace. But soon you learn that this isn't like back east, where a rain shower comes and goes. This is relentless, unending rain. The sky is gray and the trail is slick. You struggle to keep your footing on the muddy path. Soon you realize this is more than just a little rain. It's going to be a problem. And now you're stuck on the trail with nothing but mud, thick, sticky mud. At first, a little rain on the trail isn't a problem. You can keep moving. Maybe your wagon wheels leave deeper ruts or your oxen slip and slide, but you're still making progress. But rain that lasts for hours or days changes everything. dirt turns to thick, sticky mud that sucks at your boots and swallows wagon wheels whole. Pioneers often had to unload everything just to lighten the wagon enough to push it forward. Settlers might find themselves waist deep in mire, with oxen sinking to their knees around them. Wagons tipped precariously, threatening to spill their contents into the mud. Below, people slipped, fell, cursed, cried out in frustration. MUD caked their clothes, plastered their hair to their skulls. They struggled to maintain any semblance of dignity while covered from chin to toe in filth. When crossing a stream, a rushing water might become too strong and pull right through a camp, sweeping tents, beds, and boxes downstream. Some travelers ended up spending their nights sleeping in the wagon, using their supplies as pillows, eating cold beans for dinner. Any pioneer who has ever crossed an unsettled region knows that when the rains come, you can forget about traveling comfortably. Instead, you need to move slowly, carefully, methodically, so that you don't slip and fall. When the rain never stops, hope is the only thing that keeps you moving. But eventually you reach a river that has turned into a raging torrent. In some cases, pioneers described the crossing as easy. A river that had been a trickle turned into a wide but shallow sheet of water, knee-deep at most. For an adult, crossing was as simple as wetting your britches, but many crossings were far from simple. Imagine that same river days later, after a storm, and finding that same river swollen to 6 feet deep, moving with terrifying force. Settlers were faced with a difficult choice. You couldn't wait for the water to recede. The trail kept moving, so you had 3 options. First, caulk the wagon. You seal the seams with tar or grease and float it across like a boat. Then you have to pray it didn't capsize. Your second option was to ford the river. You unload everything and then guide the oxen across, hoping they didn't lose footing and get swept away. Your third and final option was to wait. You camp by the banks, build another fire, and then hope the river recedes by morning. But waiting meant eating into your food, your energy, and your morale. And with so much of the trip still ahead of you, you decide to go on. You take a deep breath, clench your jaw, and charge forward. You wade into the icy water, guiding your oxen before you. One slip of your foot could send you sprawling into the mud. One stumble from your oxen could send you and your cargo crashing into the current. And even one wrong move from your teamsters could send the wagon tilting dangerously off balance. But you have to make it across. Some settlers chose to take their chances with the river. Some made it across without incident. Some succeeded, but only after many attempts, and others lost everything. A sudden rise in the current could sweep a wagon away, capsizing it, drowning its occupants. Children could be pulled under by the current, and a month's worth of supplies could be washed away in an instant. When you kept going, it was a race against the clock, and the river always had the advantage. In the midst of these thunderstorms, tornadoes and twisters were not unheard of on the flatlands of Kansas and Nebraska. With little to no warning, a funnel cloud would descend and tear across the landscape, snatching wagons, animals, and people right up into the air. There was no warning siren, no radar, no meteorologists predicting the severity or location of the next storm. All a family had was experience and instinct to help them survive. Pioneers often spotted twisters in the distance and had plenty of time to prepare. They would unhitch their oxen and allow them to roam free. After all, a tornado wouldn't bother chasing down an angry bull. They pitched their wagons on their sides to form a protective barrier between their families and the elements. And then they huddled together inside, covering their heads with whatever they could find. But even if you saw it coming, there wasn't anything you could do to stop it. Tornadoes rolled across the Great Plains with little rhyme or reason. And sometimes they struck without any warning at all. If the wind suddenly shifted or the barometric pressure dropped, a twister could appear out of nowhere. Families would scramble to complete their chores as quickly as possible, knowing that every moment could be their last. Sometimes a tornado would lift a house clean off its foundation and toss it like a dollhouse house. Other times, it might simply sweep across the landscape, knocking people off their feet and leaving them bruised and battered. And even though there was nothing they could do to prevent a tornado from passing through, pioneers did have some say in how well they survived. Most tornadoes moved quickly and didn't stick around long enough to cause major damage. But those that lingered could carve entire gullies into the landscape, leaving behind scars that lasted for years. Some families lost livestock, crops, furniture, and even their homes to these whirling dervishes of destruction. Occasionally, a tornado would strike right through a town, leveling buildings and tossing people into the air. Entire neighborhoods would be wiped off the map. And then other times, inexplicably, a tornado would strike and pass without touching a soul. Even decades later, the effects of a single tornado could still be seen. Pioneers reported finding tracks that stretched for miles across the landscape, twisting through fields and across valleys. Sometimes the only thing left behind was a twisted fence post or an overturned rock. Other times, a family might find their entire barn tossed right over a hill, several hundred yards away, and the pioneers had to pick up and move on. When a tornado tore through a settlement, people were killed and injured, their bodies broken by the winds of nature's fury. But the sun would come up the next morning, and the work would have to be done. Someone had to bury the dead, care for the sick and wounded, and see to the needs of the living. People came together after a tornado, helping each other rebuild their lives, their homes, and their farms. In some cases, entire communities were raised up and moved to higher ground. And in others, people simply began to piece their lives back together, brick by brick, board by board. It seems as though the Great Plains threw everything it could at our pioneers: mud, floods, tornadoes, dust storms, and heat waves. But through it all, the pioneers pressed on, determined to forge a new life for themselves in the wild frontier. But what was waiting for them on the other side? To find out, click here to watch this video or click here to see this one. The pioneers who settled the Great Plains in the 1800s encountered some pretty scary stuff: snakes, bears, stampedes, each other, and the forces of nature itself. But life on the frontier was tough enough already without having to deal with an angry sky raining down destruction. So when Mother Nature decided she'd had enough of this homesteading nonsense, she hit back with massive storms that leveled entire settlements. But what did those look like? Here are just some of the worst weather events the pioneers ever faced. You'd see it, a thin, dark finger reaching from the clouds to the earth, twisting its way across the prairie, fast, silent at first. And then, like a train barreling forward, it roared. It was a tornado, and the pioneers had no warning system, no National Weather Service to watch for these twisting vortices of awfulness. All they had were each other, and sometimes that wasn't enough. The first settlers on the Kansas prairie in the 1850s recorded seeing 3 tornadoes in a single day. In 1873, George Bird Grinnell witnessed one that lifted a schooner 20 feet into the air and carried it more than a mile. Then there was the time in May 1880 when a group of Kansas farmers looked up to see the funnel clouds bearing down on them. There was nowhere to hide. The only thing to do was to kneel in the grass and try and ride it out. According to the Wichita Daily Eagle, they reached down and scooped up the dirt and straw hat of one of the men and carried it aloft 60 feet. They returned it about 10 rods south, where it was found on the bank of a creek. Not much of a survivor, that one. Some tornadoes cut the ground, others reached right down and took what they wanted. But all the pioneers knew was that when that dark finger pointed your way, it was time to get out of the open. Sometimes the sky opened not with rain, but with ice. Hailstorms the size of fists. In April 1874, a storm rolled in on the Colorado-New Mexico border that stunned the few settlers living in the area. The sky darkened and the wind began to pick up. Then suddenly hailstones as large as walnuts came crashing down. For 4 hours, the ice pelted the ground, shattering window glass and tearing through the canvas tops of wagons. When it was over, the landscape was transformed. The hail had piled up in some places in drifts 3 feet deep. What had been smooth fields were now transformed into a sheet of ice. And the pioneers were battered, bruised, and shocked. Those were relatively small hailstones. A few years later near Denver, the stones were the size of goose eggs. And in May of 1879, near Liberal, Kansas, the hailstones were the size of fists. Imagine getting hit in the head with one of those, and you have some idea of what the pioneers endured. But even those weren't the biggest ever reported. On July 19, 1873, near Arcola, Missouri, something big and icy crashed down from the sky. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat reported that the largest pieces of hail measured 9 inches in circumference. That's roughly the size of a basketball. Imagine trying to protect your kids from that. And remember, these are just the ones that got reported. No one knows how many giant hailstones actually fell from the sky during the Pioneer era and smashed into the plains, either because no one was around to see them or no one thought to measure them. But sometimes there was no hiding from the sky, just praying it would end soon. Drowning rain. When the rains came to the Great Plains, they came hard. But that wasn't really a problem for the pioneers, or at least it shouldn't have been. After all, they'd come to this semi-arid land because they wanted to farm it. But there was a difference between a light, steady rainfall and the torrential downpours that occasionally slammed into the plains. The problem was that these storms dumped huge amounts of water in very little time, much more than the parched soil could absorb. And so the result was devastating. The water pooled, forming vast, stinking lakes that swallowed everything in sight. Homes were inundated, farms were wiped away, and people were stranded. The rains began almost as soon as the pioneers arrived. When Lieutenant Colonel Richard Dodge led his regiment of soldiers into Kansas in 1864, he found whole wagon trains stuck in the mud. The heavy rains continued throughout the summer, swelling streams, rivers, and lakes. Roads were impassable, bridges were destroyed, and supplies were difficult to bring in. By August, Dodge was ready to leave the territory, but his troops were still stuck. He wrote that the rain, the dust, the mud, the heat, and flies had nearly driven them all insane. Finally, on September, the skies cleared and the sun came out. Dodge's soldiers set out and made good time until their supplies gave out. They were forced to forage for food, which consisted mainly of mush, and were forced to wear their overcoats as a protection against the biting wind. It was October before they finally made it out of the territory. But even that was mild compared to what was to come. In 1867, a rainstorm dumped 15 inches of water on a section of Kansas in just 3 days. This wasn't a normal occurrence, but it wasn't rare either. Throughout the rest of the century, the Kansas settlers had to endure dozens of similar floods that washed out bridges, destroyed homes, and left travelers stranded. If too much rain was dangerous, too little invited fire. The prairie grasses, tall and dry, could ignite with terrifying ease. And when it happened, the result was horrifying. A spark from a campfire, a lightning strike, even the metal rim of a wagon wheel grinding against rock. All it took was one small ember and the tinder-dry prairie to catch it. Then it was off to the races. Prairie fires moved faster than most could imagine, wine-fed, roaring, leaping through the grass with deadly speed. When Mary Elizabeth Lee saw one in 1874, she cried out, "Good God, it's alive!" As the blaze approached, people fled, hoping the fire wouldn't reach them before they did. But others were trapped. Houses burned to the ground, crops turned to ash, fences were consumed, livestock roasted alive. The sky turned black with smoke, the air grew hot and thick. The ground shook with the fire's energy. Animals panicked and people ran. Sometimes there was nothing to do but stand and watch as the fire approached. One family huddled together as the flames approached, expecting to be burned alive. Then the wind shifted and the fire roared past, leaving them coughing and choking in its wake. Fires raged across the Great Plains for hundreds of years, fueled by the winds of winter and early spring and the carelessness of humans. And while they helped clear out much of the underbrush and allowed for new growth, the true cost was devastating. According to historian D. Brown, in 1867 a fire swept through the Republican River Valley in Kansas, destroying 14 million acres of grass, 26 bridges, 250 miles of fencing, thousands of tons of hay, and killing countless numbers of cattle. A fire in 1870 burned from March to April, traveling 700 miles and crossing the Arkansas River 5 times before finally being brought under control. It was only the beginning of a terrible season of fires that continued through the fall. By the time it was over, the blaze had spread across 12 million acres in Kansas alone. When the pioneers first arrived on the Great Plains, they thought they'd found the promised land. The rolling grasslands stretched as far as the eye could see, a seemingly endless expanse of wild beauty. And while that was true, there was another side to the land, a side that revealed itself when the weather turned bad. The storms that raged across the plains were as beautiful as they were violent, a reminder that here, in the heart of America, nature was still in charge. Now check out Life of a Pioneer Woman or click this other video instead. Today you will walk 35 miles along the Oregon Trail. That's how far you'll travel if you start at dawn and walk until dark. And this is your chance, just for today, to trade places with those pioneers who traveled here more than 150 years ago. This is a rare opportunity, so are you ready? First, you must escape the flames. Some escaped by setting backfires, small, controlled burns to consume the grass before the main fire arrived. Others didn't have time. Survivors described fields turned to ash, wagons reduced to blackened frames, and silence, the eerie silence that always follows devastation. Next, you must enter the snow in June. Yes, snow? In the higher elevations, especially in the Rockies and Blue Mountains, snowstorms weren't limited to winter. Some pioneers were caught in whiteouts in May or June, unprepared, underdressed, unaware. Snow meant wet clothes, frozen fingers, halted progress. Families huddled in wagons for warmth. Firewood ran out. Livestock froze. The trail disappeared under a white shroud. Sometimes people froze, too. But neither fire nor snow could stop the pioneers' westward trek. Why wouldn't you last a day? Because most of us check the weather app before we go out. We cancel plans if it's storming. We complain when the AC breaks. We grumble about wet socks. But on the Oregon Trail, you walked through it all. The thunder, the lightning, the hail, the heat. You pitched a wet tent with cold fingers. You bailed water out of your wagon. You tied your hat tighter and kept walking. You didn't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect day. There were no perfect days on the trail. Just the strength to keep going, even when the sky raged above you. Now sleep beneath the storm, but let the wind fade. Picture the distant rumble of thunder. The last drops of rain sliding down Kansas. A small fire crackling under a makeshift awning. Let yourself curl beneath a threadbare quilt. The worst of the storm has passed. For now, sleep softly, traveler. You wake to the sound of birds, the patter of raindrops on the tent, the soft breathing of family members nestled around you in the pre-dawn darkness. Outside, the temperature hovers near freezing. Your breath plucks little puffs of vapor from the air. Inside the tent, you're snug and warm, thankful for the companionship of your fellow travelers. It's not much of a shelter, but it is home for now. The thought of moving into a sturdy house someday sustains you. That's what lies ahead, a place you can call your own, a place where you won't need a tent to keep safe, a place where storms can't touch you. Maybe maybe a place like this one? Welcome to Fort Laramie, Wyoming. If the pioneers had an Airbnb, it would look something like this. This 2-bedroom, 1-bath beauty is located just outside the historic Fort Laramie National Historic Site. The space has been lovingly restored while still retaining its original charm. Can you picture yourself sipping coffee on the porch swing as the sun rises over the prairie? Or perhaps you prefer to stargaze from the comfort of the master bedroom, which has exposed beams and enough room for a king-size bed. Not to mention the second bedroom is large enough to store all your supplies for the journey west. Oh, and the entire property is fenced, so your oxen won't wander off in the middle of the night. All these modern conveniences make this place feel like a true oasis. Welcome to the prairie. You don't really know the meaning of vast until you stand on the high plains of the Great Plains. To the horizon and beyond, there stretches nothing but prairie. Rolling grasslands broken only by the occasional clump of trees or the meandering path of a river. Out here, the sky meets the earth in a breathtaking panorama that never grows old. When you walk the prairie, it's easy to see why the pioneers called this area the Sea of Grass. The grasses grow tall and wild, swaying gently in the breeze. Walking among them feels like strolling through a golden ocean. The wind whispers secrets through the stalks, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the sound of freedom. The wide open spaces of the prairie have a way of clearing your mind and filling your soul with a sense of adventure and possibility. Here, the only limits are the ones you set for yourself. So take a deep breath, feel the sun on your face, and let your spirit run wild on the endless expanse of the Great Plains. Welcome to Independence, Missouri. Independence, Missouri was the starting point for many pioneers who set out to Oregon. Back then, the town wasn't much, just a small settlement on the frontier. But for the pioneers, it represented a gateway to the unknown, a place where they could gather supplies and prepare for the long journey ahead. Today, Independence is still standing, but it's grown into a bustling city. Visitors can explore the town's rich history at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum or catch a show at the historic Memorial Hall. But no matter how much Independence changes, it will always hold a special place in history as the starting point for those brave souls who set out to find their fortune in Oregon. You won't last a day on the Oregon Trail without food. That means you need to hunt. With a population of bison estimated in the tens of millions, these shaggy beasts were well adapted to life on the Great Plains. Their massive size and sharp horns made them formidable opponents, but experienced hunters knew how to track and take down these creatures. Every part of the bison was used, from its meat to its hide, bones, and even brain. No wonder these magnificent animals were nicknamed the kings of the plains. It's noon, time for some grub. Imagine opening your supplies box and finding a sandwich waiting for you. Relief washes over you. But as you take a bite, you realize it's not your PB&J, but a pile of dried beef. These hearty rations were a staple of the pioneer diet, along with other dried meats like bacon and eggs. Pioneers also packed flour, sugar, coffee, and chocolate. Of course, you've got plenty of that on hand. As you sit down to eat, you notice a grasshopper or a hopping nearby. They probably won't bother you. In fact, back then, grasshoppers were considered a tasty treat, a source of protein, and a welcome addition to the monotonous diet of dried goods. Sure, they might not be everyone's cup of tea, but hey, you're on an Oregon Trail Time crunch. The rest of your day will be filled with the usual tasks of camp life, collecting firewood, cooking meals, tending to the animals. But the most important thing is staying on trail. Getting lost meant certain death, starvation, exposure, accidents. Staying on trail meant safety, survival, reaching Oregon. You won't last a day on the Oregon Trail without direction. That meant following the wagon tracks left behind by others. Some parts of the trail were clearly marked, like the Arkansas River, which served as a natural highway through the Rocky Mountains. Other landmarks were less obvious, like the Sweetwater River or the sandstone formations known as Independence Rock. But with a keen eye and a steady resolve, pioneers could navigate the treacherous terrain and stay on course. Following the wagon tracks was essential, ensuring that each step brought you closer to your destination. It wasn't just a way to find your way, it was a lifeline to the promise of a new life in Oregon. You won't last a day on the Oregon Trail without wheels, so get to work fixing this wheel. If you're a man, that is, because women had their own jobs to do. Women were responsible for cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children, but they also had important roles in the wagon train, like keeping an eye on the oxen. Yes, oxen were the primary mode of transportation, pulling covered wagons loaded with supplies and equipment. Each team consisted of several oxen, usually for 2-6, which were led by a teamster. Men were responsible for driving the oxen, navigating the terrain, and setting up camp. But they also had other duties like hunting for food and collecting firewood. Life on the Oregon Trail was hard and dangerous, but the pioneers were a hardy lot. They were determined to reach Oregon and build a new life for themselves and their families. And they were willing to work hard to achieve their goal. Now get to work. Don't worry, you'll make it. With a little elbow grease, that wheel should be good to go. After all, it's not like you're on a tight schedule or anything. You have months to get to Oregon. It's not like there's a race against time or anything. But you won't last a day on the Oregon Trail without luck. You've heard stories of wagon trains wiped out by disease, travelers lost to bandits, pioneers perishing in the wilderness. Now it's your turn to test your luck. Will you survive the journey? Will you reach Oregon? The outcome is in your hands, or rather in Lady Luck's hands. She's a fickle mistress. The Oregon Trail is a test of endurance, a battle against the elements, a race against time. It's a journey fraught with danger and uncertainty, but the pioneers pressed on, driven by their desire for a better life. Would you have what it takes to survive the trek? To find out, take our quiz.